Rachel Yessey. Rachel Yessey is a registered naturopathic nutritionist and founder of Be Nourished, which is a UK-based nutrition and lifestyle consultancy agency, and that is leading the way in personalized nutrition for supporting resistance, resilience, and recovery for chronic illnesses. Rachel have enjoyed 12 years of clinical experience and she has gained extensive knowledge in the nutrition and integrative healthcare space and works with clients both nationally and internationally. Rachel has been researching and working exclusively on long COVID for the past 2 years and helps her patients to identify the root cause of disease, processes, and develops personalized nutrition and lifestyle protocols to support recovery. So let's welcome Rachel Yessey. You can share your screen, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be presenting to you all today. Dr. Leo Galland, thank you so much for that excellent presentation, really informative information. So today I'm going to be talking through the Kynurinine pathway. So we're going to start with talking about tryptophan metabolism, and then I'm going to take you on a deep dive down the Kynurinine pathway and try and explain that in the best way I possibly can. And then we're going to look at a little molecule called NAD+ and why this is important. And then we're going to look at how the Kynurinine pathway is affected in COVID-19, so how neurological function is affected in COVID-19 and long COVID. And then I'm just going to talk you through some of the interventions that I have been using in clinics. So they're primarily dietary and lifestyle related. So I want to note that I'm going to be referring to this pathway in the context of neurological function alone. So before we dive into the pathway, let's have a quick look at tryptophan. So tryptophan is an essential amino acid. This means that our body can't make it, so we need to get it from our food, and around 1 to 10% is going down the serotonin pathway. A portion of that gets metabolized into indoles, and then the rest, around 95%, depending on what publication you're reading, enters the kynurenine pathway. And then we've got this quite scary diagram here. So this is the kynurenine pathway. So I'm going to try my best to break this down as simply as I possibly can. So this diagram here is basically showing you the pathway in detail. And as you can see, there are several conversions and metabolites that are produced along each of these stages. And each of the metabolites are going to exert a specific function on the body. And when this pathway works well, it's working beautifully because it's controlling inflammation, it's supporting our immune function, it plays a massive role in neurological function and also energy production. So a couple of things that I want to note along this pathway is that the metabolism of tryptophan down into kynurenine depends on the IDO and the TDO enzymes. And kynurenine itself plays a really important role as what we call an immune checkpoint molecule. So it's regulating various immune responses via a feedback mechanism related to the aryl hydrocarbon receptors. Now, I'm not going to talk about that, but this is basically to note that this top portion of this kynurenine pathway is involved in immune function. And then kynurenine can be converted into differing metabolites via 3 specific enzyme pathways. So this enzyme pathway here, so kynurenine into kynurenic acid, takes place in the presence of the CATS enzymes. And kynurenic acid is an N-methyl D-aspartate antagonist. So what does that mean? Now, I'm going to refer to N-methyl D-aspartate as NMDA. And basically, What NMDA does is it mimics the action of glutamate at the NMDA receptors. So it exerts an excitotoxic effect. So basically what kynurenic acid does is it blocks this receptor. So it exerts an anti-excitotoxic and anti-convulsant effect at the receptor. So kynurenic acid is generally considered to be neuroprotective. And then you have the KMO enzymes and the kynurenase enzymes that basically push kynurenine down this pathway to ultimately end up as 3-hydroxy and anthranilic acid. Now, this section of the pathway generates quite a lot of free radicals and reactive oxygen species, but in the presence of that, there's also going to be an activation of the antioxidant system. So, this is just another example in this pathway of balance. And then when we get to 3-hydroxyanthranilic acid, this can be converted down the pathway to quinolinic acid or picolinic acid. Now, quinolinic acid is really important because this is an NMDA agonist. So it's got the opposing function to kynurenic acid, and it's also referred to as an excitotoxin. And picolinic acid is thought to be a neuroprotector. Now, the pot of gold at the end of the kynurenine pathway, this is what I refer to it as, is this molecule here, NAD+. And then you can see that all of these nutrients are involved in the conversion steps of this pathway down to NAD+. So we've got vitamin B6, B2, magnesium, and B3, which we know as niacin. And then this second diagram, which I'm not going to go into great detail in, but I just wanted to highlight that the kynurenine pathway also relies on the niacin-dependent priest-handler pathway, which begins with nicotinic acid or niacin, B3, however you want to call it. And it's important in the process of generating NAD. So basically, niacin is going to be pushed down this pathway. It's going to meet with quinolinic acid, and it's going to produce NAD+. And also up here, we've got the CD38 pathway, which is a major consumer of NAD. And that feeds niacin-like metabolites down into the NAD salvage pathway. So really, this whole mechanism is responsible for recycling and generating NAD+. So why is NAD so important? So it's got a lot of functions within the body. So one, it's supporting a healthy mitochondrial function. So it's involved in glycolysis, it is involved in the citric acid cycle, it's involved in oxidative phosphorylation and the generation of ATP. So you can break that down into it's important for energy production. And it also helps to balance T cell metabolism. So it's stabilizing our macrophage phenotype. So we have a tight balance between the inflammatory macrophages, known as the M1 macrophages, and the M2 macrophages, which are our resolving macrophages. So you can see that NAD+, if it goes out of balance, then you're going to get an imbalance within the immune system. And then we have protein molecules called sirtuins and poly-ADP ribose polymerases, which I just refer to as the SIRTs and the PARPs. Now, these are major consumers of NAD+, and what these protein molecules do is that they protect our genes, so they're having a direct effect on our epigenetic expression. And then the other cool thing about NAD+ is it regulates circadian expression of important metabolic genes. It's sensing things like nutrient availability, insulin, it helps regulate sleep and wake cycle, and it's also heavily involved in reproduction as well. So you can see why it's really important that we make this molecule from a properly functioning kynurenine pathway. So how does this all translate into COVID-19? Well, there have been a couple of human studies looking at the effect of COVID-19 on the kynurenine pathway. And we'll start off with this first study that was done in 2020, which found that in response to increases in interleukin-6 during COVID-19 infection, this was corresponding with a shift in tryptophan metabolism towards the kynurenine pathway and away from serotonin production. And it's also generally well accepted that IL-6 and other inflammatory cytokines are actually potent inducers of these IDO enzymes. And if you remember, the IDO enzymes are responsible for pushing tryptophan down into the kynurenine pathway. So these are upregulated in response to cytokines. And next we have another study. This is more recent. This was done in 2022 that found that a lot of important markers within the kynurenine pathway were significantly different in COVID-19 patients when compared to control. And according to the results of this study, kynurenine metabolites play a really important role in the pathophysiology of COVID-19, and there seems to be an increased ratio between kynurenine and tryptophan. And interestingly, in this study, they found that picolinic acid was also raised. And if you remember, picolinic acid is neuroprotective. So this is suggesting that this pathway is trying really hard to gain some balance and control over excess inflammatory processes. So on the back of these studies, there's been quite a lot of research into the kynurenine pathway and how dysregulation of this pathway could be implicated in long COVID. So this first diagram here is showing you that in response to spike protein, you're going to get diminished ACE2. And this is going to inhibit major amino acid transporters, which are here. And these transporters are responsible for getting tryptophan and other amino acids across the gut wall and into the bloodstream. So you're looking at a potential amino acid malabsorption here within the gut. The other mechanism at play is that in the presence of persistent inflammation, so these inflammatory cytokines, there's going to be increased expression of the IDO enzymes, which further increases the conversion of tryptophan down into the kynurenine pathway. And these mechanisms are thought to persist in those experiencing the lasting neurological effects of COVID-19. So let's visualize this information in the context of the main functions of the kynurenine pathway. So we've just found out that in the presence of disrupted tryptophan absorption and upregulated IDO enzyme activity, we're going to see tryptophan pushed down into the kynurenine pathway at the potential expense of serotonin production. Now, when excess kynurenine is produced, it's preferentially directed down this enzyme pathway here, the KMO enzymes, as opposed to the CATS enzymes. So at this point in the pathway, there is a potential that there's going to be insufficient production of neuroprotective kynurenic acid for the upcoming storm that's going to be coming further down the pathway. And this is further exacerbated in a vitamin B6 deficiency because we need vitamin B6 to make these CATS enzymes function properly. And so as you see a push down into this pathway, you're going to start to see an excessive production of 3-hydroxykynurenine and 3-hydroxyanthranilic acid, which will exacerbate the production of reactive oxygen species. And you're going to start to see that overwhelming the antioxidant capabilities. And then a further push down into this pathway is going to result in mitochondrial membrane destabilization, disruption to the electron transport chain, and this is where fatigue is going to start coming in, brain fog, all of these symptoms. And then what will happen is you will go down into producing quinolinic acid or picolinic acid. Now, although some neuroprotective picolinic acid is going to be produced, these 3-HAO enzymes here are very, very efficient at pushing 3-hydroxyanthranilic acid into kynurenic acid. And on the opposite effect, this QPRT enzyme is a little bit slower at converting quinolinic acid to NAD+. So what you're going to end up with is a bottleneck here of quinolinic acid, and that's going to increase the NMDA receptor response. It's going to increase more reactive oxygen species, and it's going to produce excitotoxic and neurotoxic effects on the brain. So lastly, actually, I wanted to point out something extra along this pathway referring to the TDO enzymes. So these TDO enzymes are upregulated by glucocorticoids, in particular cortisol. And this pathway, I believe, is also relevant to long COVID, because with chronic health symptoms also comes fear and health anxiety, which I'm seeing a lot within my own patients. And all this is going to result in is kind of a positive feedback loop where, you know, with increased fear, increased health anxiety, it's going to drive up cortisol levels. This is going to upregulate TDO and drive more tryptophan down into the kynurenine pathway. And then if you've got more stress and more anxiety and more cortisol, you are going to deplete further the B vitamins and the magnesium needed for all of these conversions within this pathway, and particularly quinolinic acid to NAD+, which is so dependent on niacin, which is a B vitamin, and also magnesium. So in a nutshell, excess quinolinic acid is going to have neurotoxic effects in quite a major way. And the primary mechanism behind this is largely related with the overactivation of these NMDA receptors. So what's going to happen when these are overactivated is you're going to see an increase in calcium ions, and this is going to negatively impact on our antioxidant capability. So it's going to reduce superoxide dismutase and glutathione peroxidases, but also what you're going to see is an activation of inflammation through the COX and LOX pathways. And also to note is that quinolinic acid also directly interacts with free iron, and this joins together to form a kind of toxic complex that exacerbates oxidative stress and induces lipid peroxidation, increases peroxynitrite, which is toxic, and then you're going to end up with mitochondrial dysfunction, ATP exhaustion, and then you're going to get cytochrome C release, which is ultimately going to lead to the death of the cell. And eventually these toxic signals can be extended to reach other cells within the brain, and this is what starts the degenerative chain reaction. And so this quite impressive infographic here is kind of summarizing all of this. So when we tie it all together into how the brain is potentially being affected by the spike protein, you can see that once the immune system is activated, you're going to get a push in the or an increased release of cytokines and microglia activation, which is going to result in increased kynurenine, increased quinolinic acid and glutamate, and this is going to deplete serotonin production, dopamine and norepinephrine, which kind of switches all of these mechanisms off. And so you're going to lead to altered neurotransmission. There's going to be neuronal damage and increased excitotoxicity, and there's going to be hypoxic injury, and all of these are contributing to these neuropsychiatric and also neurodegenerative symptoms that we are starting to see in long COVID. So after painting a relatively gloomy picture of the tryptophan kynurenine pathway in long COVID, there are many things that can be done to support this pathway. I want to mention that the information that Dr. Leo Galland has just presented on the use of antioxidants, flavonoids and polyphenols such as vitamin E, quercetin, EGCG and curcumin not only support gut function, which is something that I'm looking at optimizing as well, but it also helps to mitigate the detrimental effects that can be seen in a dysfunctional kynurenine pathway. So supporting mitochondrial function, offsetting the detrimental effects of reactive oxygen species, improving the absorption of amino acids across the gut wall and helping to balance inflammation. So I won't touch too much on all of these because they've been covered in quite a lot of detail already, but there's some further logical aspects that I consider when supporting this specific pathway. We know that excess inflammation, excess stress, increased reactive oxygen species, poor gut health and nutritional insufficiencies are putting pressure on this pathway. So to me, it makes sense to address all these factors. And so my approach is very much about going back to basics and addressing these foundational aspects of nutrition and lifestyle. So on top of addressing the gut and antioxidant and polyphenol intake, I perform a dietary analysis. I will use testing to assess the kynurenine pathway, and I will look to address any of the nutritional deficiencies that I find, particularly those involved in this particular pathway. For instance, I'll be looking at protein, magnesium, B vitamins, and iron, which all play a vital role in the downstream cascade of the conversion of kynurenine to NAD+. And so when I'm looking at optimizing dietary intake, from my perspective, this is highly personalized. So there is not one size fits all here. But what I'm finding is, or what I'm going to discuss are the general trends that I'm seeing in my clinic. So don't take this as specific advice. This is just kind of what I'm noticing. So what I'm finding is that people are better off on organic and glyphosate-free food. Some patients are doing really well on low histamine diets. Others are doing well on low oxalate diets. And this is because some of the bacteria that are responsible for degrading oxalate in the gut can be diminished, in which case I'll be taking oxalates out until we support gut function. And from a protein perspective, I'm using anywhere between 0.8 and 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So this is effective for kind of restoring muscle mass if that's been lost, but also helping to really support with the amino acids coming in through the diet to ensure that we're getting as much as possible and as good quality as possible. And then I look for good quality carbohydrates. These can be useful. Gluten-free organic tends to be best. People tend to respond better to that. However, of note is that some people are really achieving some benefit with ketogenic diets. And this ties in really nicely because ketogenic diets are used to treat epilepsy. So there is a rationale to support the use of this diet. Low carbohydrate diets with or without intermittent fasting can be really beneficial for some. And again, this is just for some people. Not everyone is going to respond to this kind of intervention. It's all really highly personalized. And then I'm looking to introduce color and diversity through fruits and vegetables, herbs and spices. This is going to introduce fiber to support the gut microbiome, which is what Dr. Galland has talked about. It's going to introduce natural sources of polyphenols, flavonoids, antioxidants, extra vitamins and minerals to support inflammation and redox reactions. And then I don't think any of us are going to disagree with the fact that processed foods, refined sugars, high fructose corn syrups, and highly inflammatory seed, corn, canola, vegetable oils are going to be a bad thing. The beneficial effects of removing these foods from the diet can actually come quite quickly because these foods contribute quite heavily to the reactive oxygen species and the activation of the immune system that can exacerbate certain symptoms. So I prefer to move people from seed, corn and vegetable oils to high quality olive oils. I might use fish oils and then I will, where appropriate, will be using fish in its natural form and animal fats. And again, this is where appropriate because not everybody handles dietary fats in the same way. So I'll be really careful about how I apply this in clinical practice. So all in all, dietary interventions and addressing gut health can be a powerful tool in reducing inflammation and IDO production. It's going to protect mitochondrial function. It's going to reduce the effects of reactive oxygen species, but it's also going to support the kynurenine pathway into safely producing NAD+. And then with regards to lifestyle intervention, so I place focus on reducing stress. This again is going to support inflammation and reduce the expression of the TDO and the IDO enzymes. So I'll be looking at things like, encouraging people to take time out in nature, take time away from their screens, meditate, turning off social media and disengaging from Facebook groups and media outlets that induce or maintain a constant state of fight and flight responses. And then I'll look to reduce toxin exposure. This is going to take pressure off the gut, the liver, the kidney axis, and this can look like, you know, something really simple things like filtering water or removing plastics as much as possible from the environment, and then eating organic food, or at least reducing as much as possible pesticide and herbicide exposure. And then you can look at swapping things like cleaning products and personal hygiene products to less toxic alternatives. And another thing I really like to do is support the oral microbiome. So it's now widely accepted that oral hygiene has far-reaching effects on the body, and actually some microbes within the oral cavity can activate the immune system. So, you know, what we're trying to do within all of this is kind of support the immune system and take the pressure off of it as much as possible, so that we can reduce the expression of these inflammatory cytokines and the IDO enzymes. So I have some pretty robust oral hygiene protocols that I'll provide to some patients if they need it. And then lastly, I wanted to say to, you know, all of those suffering with long COVID, and indeed anyone suffering with any unresolved chronic illness, is that, you know, I know how debilitating and frightening this experience can be. But one thing I do say to all of my patients is to kind of stop researching and start taking action, because when you're looking at scary research papers and news articles, it's really not helping. It's actually impacting this pathway quite radically, and hopefully it's now clear that you know, why we need to kind of step away from this and start taking action is going to really help promote this pathway into a less inflammatory way. So there are solutions. It might take a while to find the right one, but in my experience over the last 2 years, I find that the clients that really tune out of information outlets that promote negative thought patterns and behaviors have really improved a lot quicker. The recovery rates have been a lot more robust. So it has been an absolute pleasure presenting here at the 4th Long COVID Coalition, and thanks for having me. And also thank you to everyone who has been organising these events, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rachel. That was great.
Thank you.
So I'll start with the question, Rachel, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Galland. So I would just like to know, what are your thoughts about the ketogenic diet, or if we talk about a kind of an intermittent fasting. So what are your thoughts on that, and how do you think it correlates with the pathway?
So I think it's highly individualized. So I tend to do quite a lot of testing on my clients when they come through. So I'll be seeing how they're handling fats. I'll be seeing how they're handling things like carbohydrates, because I don't see any point in taking carbohydrates strictly out of the diet, because ultimately that is our quickest source of using energy. So once I've really assess the patient, and depending on, you know, how they can handle a ketogenic diet, then I may recommend it under supervision. But it's quite a radical thing to implement, and I find people who are really suffering with long COVID, it can be quite detrimental, because it will initiate that initial period of low energy, and some other nasty side effects. So, you know, it's very, very personalized, and it all depends on the initial presentation of the client.
Sure. I would also just like to check with you, like, if certain people been already prescribed with certain medications, what they are taking alongside for the treatment for their long COVID, or even if they have a COVID, and you do a personalized kind of a plan for them, do you think it varies? And how do you manage those things, and what are the things you take in consideration?
Yeah, so a lot of people are coming to me with polypharmacy, so that's a really big thing that I see within my clinic, because I think what the trend that I'm seeing is that people with long COVID have had kind of pre-existing conditions that have been unresolved, and then it kind of COVID-19 or the infection seems to exacerbate those symptoms even further. So yeah, I get a lot of polypharmacy, but I've got an excellent drug nutrient interaction checker, so I will not prescribe any supplement until I've gone through quite rigorous checks to make sure that there's no interactions going on whatsoever.
Right. Thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome.
I just want to say something about intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
There are definite beneficial effects on the gut bacteria that result from intermittent fasting, independent of the nature of the diet. I think the ketogenic diet is so unpredictable in the way that it will impact different people, and actually the way in which it impacts the gut microbiome of individuals. There are situations in which a ketogenic diet actually, in patients with multiple sclerosis, for example, helps to restore a healthier gut microbiome, but it takes 6 months to a year.
Mm.
The intermittent fasting was shown to increase the ability of clostridial bacteria to produce this neuroprotective anti-inflammatory metabolite, indole 3 propionate, IPA. And so there may be a specific benefit, at least in laboratory animals, that hasn't been looked at in humans, but there may be a specific effect, anti-inflammatory effect of intermittent fasting on the impact of the gut microbiome.
Right.
I think the other thing that I would add about the ketogenic diet as well is that if someone has got quite a lot of gram-negative bacteria within the gut, you can end up with translocation of endotoxins
Yeah.
in the presence of a high-fat diet. So that's another thing that you have to take into consideration before adopting ketogenic diets.
Sure. And you was talking, Rachel, about the free radicals as well in this pathway. So do you think they are good or they are bad? And but because it varies, and in different diseases, it don't consider as sometimes good as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so within this particular pathway, there's a lot of free radical production going on anyway when it's working optimally. And in response to those free radical productions, you're going to get antioxidants being produced as well within that pathway, and it balances itself out perfectly, because we do need a certain degree of reactive oxygen species to, destroy bacteria and to support our immune function. But what happens when you're expressing this pathway too much, you're kind of overburdening that reactive oxygen species mechanism. So then you're going to start to override the capabilities of the antioxidant mechanisms in that particular pathway. But no, when kynurenine pathway works perfectly well, the antioxidants free radical production, it balances itself out perfectly.
Sure. And sorry, Dr. Galland. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just had a question for you, Rachel, about supplements. Whether you have experience using tryptophan in patients with long COVID. Right. I don't either.
I don't do it. The reason I don't do it is because I feel that it displaces other amino acids. So, we need the whole spectrum of protein, really. So I kind of focus on food.
And I've read that the majority of NAD plus in humans and other mammals is recycled. That is, it's the rescue pathway.
Yes.
Is the more active than the primary nutritional pathway.
Yeah.
Do you ever use niacin, NAD, or various forms of vitamin B3, nicotinamide mononucleotide or riboside? And what's been your experience?
Yeah, so I've used flushing niacin. I've had good results with flushing niacin. Again, you've got to be careful, what you're doing with patients with regards to that. But again, with the B vitamins, I kind of try and apply as nature intended. So, all of the Bs all together is what I prefer to do. Now, I have used, some of the other components as well, but my approach is is basically get the diet right first. If there's still nutritional deficiencies, then we'll go in with supplementation after. The thing that I find with these niacin type supplements is that you need other nutrients to kind of get them in and get them going. So sometimes it's not very good to kind of just go in with these high doses of one single nutrient. Yeah.
I was going to ask a question for the audience, so I'm just going to throw in this question before we move on. I'm wondering if a fecal transplant could be of help. He had autoimmune problems for 30 years. Any thoughts about that?
Quite a lot of animal studies that show that that's really useful. Dr. Galland would probably be able to answer that better than I would.
There's a lot of data on the potential benefits of fecal transplants. And I've seen some dramatic improvement in different individuals. The donor is the critical factor. Or actually, there are two critical factors. One is the prep that you give the recipient and to prepare the gut for the transplant. But the donor is really critical because I've seen people get much worse after fecal transplants as well.